Hey there, welcome to episode number 14 of We're Just Talking About It. Thanks for tuning in this week where we wrap up our conversation with Munim. He's a young Muslim man who moved to America when he was just 8 years old. Munim has been such an enjoyable guest to have on the show. He has willingly shared his perspective and experiences of what it's like growing up as a Muslim in America. And in episode number 14, we talk about Muslims and the media in America. We talk about what is entertainment versus real news and why Munim is cautiously optimistic about the future of religion in America. The theme of this episode, as long as we're talking, we're moving in the right direction. So please enjoy episode number 14 of We're Just Talking About It. Kind of mentioned it previously, just talking about how when people meet maybe another Muslim, they automatically think of what they hear on TV because they've never actually got to experience the religion or someone who is Muslim. And that was one of the topics you wanted to touch on, and I wasn't sure if we hit it, but the media portrayal of Muslims, if there was something you wanted to talk about specifically.
Thank you for that lead, and especially coming from a journalist, I appreciate that. But one of the things is, and you'll hear this all the time from people who think kind of keep an eye on the news and focus on media dynamics, is that a lot of the times, like many media figures will be like, well, where are all the Muslims who are speaking out against terrorism, who are speaking out against this, against that? And they're everywhere. But then the media actively chooses not to show those voices. So it's almost like they're creating, or they're helping to create this environment where it's very one-sided, and then complaining that the other side isn't represented. So that's just something that just always kind of irks me a little bit. And one of the examples that I think was particularly glaring about this is, you remember the attempted Times Square bombing a few years ago?
Yes.
Yeah. And so, it was a bunch of, I think, two street vendors got basically called the police, and it was basically like some Pakistani guy in an SUV full of fertilizer or whatever it was. And so you heard their names, the two vendors who called the police, over and over again. But the first person that noticed it was actually a Muslim immigrant from Africa. And so he didn't speak, he noticed the smoke coming out of the truck. He didn't speak particularly good English. And so he went over to these two other guys who were his neighbors, were on the street where they sell things. And he kind of explained to them what was going on in his broken English. And they were able to call the police. But I think there was maybe just one or two news articles that portrayed him. And so that would be, and so it's almost skewing the truth a little bit, It's not like, hey, these two non-Muslim folks called the police on this attempted bomber who happens to claim to follow the Muslim faith when it was actually another Muslim person. And so, it's just things of that nature. And that's just one example that I think a lot of Muslims and other people too always feel that for whatever reason, whether it be ratings, advertising, or whatnot, that the news as you see isn't necessarily the news as it is.
Right, and that kind of goes back to doing your homework, like you said. You found the story, you found the truth amongst the headlines, and kind of not believing the first thing you hear, but really doing your homework to find out the real story, or as much of it as you can.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily blame people for not doing that, because I work in research. Research is hard. It's not necessarily fun to do.
Right.
And when you're just kicking back, it's and watching the news, you're just going to go with the path of least resistance, what's easy. And unfortunately, what's easy sometimes is more entertainment than news. And so that's kind of, I think, sort of a blanket comment on issues in general, but especially with respect to Muslims and Muslims in America.
It's interesting you brought that example up, because I was speaking just in the last week at a church. That's one of the questions that I got from the audience, from the parishioners that were there. One of the pastors in our community invited me to speak, and they said, well, where are all the Muslims standing up against terrorism? And I explained to them, without a specific example, I said, look, there are Muslims every day that are speaking out against terrorism all around the world, but you won't see it on the evening news in America. It's not going to be on any news station. And, I'm kind of passionate about this. I've been on this mission for over 3 years now. I talk to the media all the time, and whether they're writing for news articles or they're on television, they will tell me, Jason, these are all great stories and great ideas, and we should discuss this, but it isn't going to sell ads. So my producer, my editor, is not going to let us talk about good Muslims doing good things or how we should learn to, educate ourselves about religion. it doesn't sell. We're not going to make money. It's not going to get on the air. It's not going to get any, words on a page in a paper. And I mean, you said it. We're bringing this upon ourselves in America because we refuse to talk openly, and the press, just feeds the narrative that Muslims aren't saying anything about terrorism. They're speaking out every day, but you don't hear them because no one ever brings them a microphone.
And if you work in the field, both of you, so this, I'm sure, but worldwide, the Muslims are the single largest religious group that fall victim to terror. Like all these ISIS atrocities that we hear about. Who are they directed towards?
Yeah, I mean,
and it's almost
they're killing Muslims.
Exactly, and it's almost like sometimes as a Muslim person, sometimes you feel like you're kind of you get it from both fronts, particularly with like the refusal to show like normal people, like the vast majority of Muslims, like what do? They get up in the morning, have breakfast, go to work, take their kids to school, come home, have dinner, but like you never see that, and so the only person, and I get that. I mean, basic, that's boring, and boring doesn't sell, but all of a sudden there's just so much portrayal of like the few crazy people doing crazy things that ultimately the idea that there's a whole much larger segment of people just living a normal life that happens to be of the same religion just gets lost. So I feel like I get that from one side, and then on the other side, like the people who would, the ISIS sort of people who would actively seek to pit Muslims around the world on their side against Western countries. Like if ISIS ever came to America, like I'd probably be one of the first people that they take out because I'm living proof that you can be Muslim and not their way. You know what I mean?
Right.
So
Right.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, you wouldn't be their poster child, so you'd have to be removed.
Exactly, because I'm like, so I don't know. It's always kind of an interesting thing, but I tell people that and none of them was a long time ago, and I know the anniversary was yesterday, and no matter what, like no matter who did it, no matter without the religious things involved, it's a terrible tragedy. 3,000 people died. That's crazy. That's insane, and they didn't have to die. It's just ridiculous. But one of the really weirdly, I hesitate to use the word positive, but one of the weirdly enlightening things that happened is it got people more curious about Islam. Because before then, we're just numerically a very small minority, and if you met Muslims in your daily life, great. If not, you probably didn't have a second thought. But I think finally, after a long time of this crescendo of anti-Muslim voices, particularly I think during the Obama administration from people who were opposed to him for various reasons, you're kind of getting to this point where people are realizing, okay, like we have to look at this in a more rational way. And I think it's also, people say that like young people are always more broad-minded, and I think I'm old enough that I can call other people young people. So I think like that's just becoming more of a thing where people are realizing that this is not like some evil religion. This is just a really complex problem, and it ultimately just comes down to a few evil individuals. And I know that from like people of my grandparents' age to my parents' age to my age, and now to people younger than me, like that's more and more a prevalent attitude, regardless of how many political voices may be demonizing Muslims. And let's not kid ourselves, that's a problem, and it's kind of been on the upswing the last few years. But I think based on, let me say this carefully, I know you guys are very admirably non-political, so let me follow that mold, is that regardless of who the person is in power, if a person says a lot of ridiculous things, then you just tend to believe that person is just like, oh, it's just something, he's just saying another ridiculous thing. It's not to be believed. And I think we've gotten to that point with so many people saying like demonstrably crazy, ridiculously false things, that ultimately a lot of the rightfully false generalizations about Muslims just aren't catching on as much as they might have otherwise.
Right.
So ultimately, I'm cautiously optimistic. And again, things like your podcast and people like you exist. And so ultimately, I think more and more people are just opening their eyes and learning. And that's never a bad thing.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I mean, this is how I started on this mission when I retired from the Army. I was in the Army on September 11th. I watched the Bush administration basically refuse to talk about Islam when America really had a lot of questions. I watched the Obama administration really refuse to talk about Islam. And then I retired before Obama left office, and I started talking about it because I realized how many people had questions in America, 14 years after September 11th. So I went on the road and started talking. And then the 2016 crazy election happens, which everybody starts talking about Islam, but no one's talking about it correctly. So I'm with you. I'm optimistic that even though it's been crazy words and a lot of lies, it does finally get people talking. And for all the craziness that America is, it's good when we're talking. And you're right, people do sort through the lies pretty quickly. And so I think we have a better conversation going, and we just keep pushing that. And I'm hearing, I'm talking to Muslim groups now, not just non-Muslim groups. And Muslim groups are inviting me to talk to them and figure out how can we explain this to America in a way that they can understand. You're kind of getting some traction. So I'm with you. I'm optimistic that as long as we're talking, we're moving in the right direction.
Yeah, and I know we're kind of getting close to the end of our time, but one other thing that I wanted to mention is that something that someone mentioned to me that I had never really thought about. So a few years ago, I was just having this conversation with a person who happened to be an imam, and he was from Canada. And so he said he was born and raised in Canada, and he went back. He was of Indian heritage, and so when he decided to become a cleric, he went back to India for his ministry training, and then came back to Canada where he was from. And so one of the things that he mentioned, which really just blew my mind, and I think goes hand in hand with what you were mentioning about things like this getting a lot of traction, is that there have been Muslims in the United States in significant numbers long enough that you're having Muslims who were born and raised here going into positions of clerical authority or religious scholarship. And that helps to really build a bridge to American people as a whole that an immigrant older Muslim just doesn't have the ability to do.
Yeah,
and ultimately you're also separating the religion itself from a lot of the cultural baggage of the different places that Muslims come from. So in a way, you're almost getting Islam without the cultural issues and in a way that makes sense.
Yeah.
So that's when you mentioned that, I'm like, wow, that's so true. So I think sort of the demographic and just birth rates and whatnot is definitely helping that along too.
Yeah, we're getting people to talk more, and that's in the end. I'm glad, appreciate you coming on today, and we'll probably have you on and down the road another day, and we'll do this some more times. And I look forward to keeping in touch with you as you move through your career. Happy to help and happy to meet you.
Hey, it's my pleasure. And Holly, I know we haven't met in person, but it's a pleasure to meet you as well by phone.
Likewise. It was so refreshing and just so great to speak with you. And I love you had a lot of great messages, but I love the one that it's just have a conversation, talk about it, one human to another human. So I will remember that for sure.
Thank you. So yeah, I look forward to being on again. It was a pleasure.
And that will do it for episode number 14 of We're Just Talking About It. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen with us and learn and have a conversation about Islam in America.